When we bought the house, my wife Claire and I were thrilled. It was an old Victorian, a bit run down, but full of charm and character. It had these tall windows, intricate woodwork, and even a little turret on the side. Oh, a house with history, a place we could call home. The previous owners had left suddenly, something about moving closer to family, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We were too caught up in the excitement of owning our first home. There was only one thing that seemed out of place: a door on the second floor that wouldn't open. It was a heavy, old-fashioned door with a brass knob that looked like it had seen better days. When we first toured the house, we tried to open it, thinking it might be a closet or a small storage space, but the knob wouldn't budge. The realtor brushed it off, saying it was probably just stuck or the key was missing. Old houses always have their quirks, she'd said with a shrug. Well, Claire and I didn't think much of it. We were too busy planning how to fix up the place, repainting the walls, updating the kitchen, adding our personal touches. We figured we'd deal with the door later, maybe hire a locksmith or try to jimmy it open ourselves. For the first few weeks, everything was great. We spent our weekends working on the house, and every night we fell into bed, exhausted but happy. The door on the second floor was easy to forget. It was tucked away at the end of the hall, almost hidden by the shadows cast by the tall windows. We were too preoccupied with other projects to bother with it. But then little things started happening. It started with noises, faint at first, barely noticeable. A creaking sound coming from upstairs, like footsteps. At first, we chalked it up to the house settling. Old houses are noisy, right? They creak, they groan, they make weird sounds at night. But these noises seemed different, more deliberate. One night, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, when I heard it again. Claire was already asleep upstairs, but I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, creaking across the floor above me. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was just the house settling, I told myself. Just the wind. But then the footsteps stopped, right above me, directly over the living room, in the room with the locked door. I muted the TV, straining to listen. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, I heard it again. A soft rhythmic thumping, like something tapping against the floor. I froze, my eyes glued to the ceiling. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and crept upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. An animal, maybe, or a branch scraping against the side of the house. But as I reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the hallway, I felt a cold draft wash over me. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a small window at the end. The door to the locked room stood in the shadows, looming at the far end like a sentinel. I swallowed hard, shining the flashlight toward it. For a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting just behind the door. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, my hand clenched around the flashlight. Then slowly, I approached, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold brass knob. Still wouldn't turn. But then I noticed something. There was a faint scratching sound coming from behind the door, like nails scraping against wood. I jerked my hand back, my pulse racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and hearing things. But the sound continued, soft, but unmistakable. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest, and hurried back downstairs. I didn't tell Claire about it, not at first. I didn't want to freak her out. Besides, it was probably nothing, just an old house making old house noises. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Claire started noticing the footsteps too. She'd be in the kitchen, cooking dinner, and hear what sounded like someone walking around upstairs. First, she thought it was me, but when she'd call out, there'd be no response. I'd always be somewhere else, in the garage or outside in the yard. She tried to brush it off, but I could see the unease in her eyes. One night, as we were lying in bed, we both heard it at the same time, the distinct sound of the doorknob on the locked door rattling. It was a soft metallic clink, like someone trying to open the door from the other side. Claire grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't know what to say. We lay there in the dark, listening as the doorknob rattled again, then stopped. The house was silent once more, but the tension in the air was palpable. The next day, I decided to deal with the door once and for all. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and marched upstairs, determined to pry the damn thing open. Claire followed me, her face pale, but she didn't say anything. When we reached the door, I hesitated for a moment. The hallway was unnervingly quiet, the air cold and still. I felt that same sense of being watched, like there was something just beyond the door waiting. But I steeled myself and wedged the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame. It took a few tries, but eventually, the wood splintered, and the door creaked open with a groan. The room beyond was dark, the air stale and musty. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight as I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was small, barely more than a closet, with peeling wallpaper and a cracked window on the far wall. But what immediately caught my attention was the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sour, metallic stench of decay. I shined the flashlight around the room, my hands shaking. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for years. But in the center of the room, something glinted in the light. It was a small metal latch bolted to the floor. I knelt down, my stomach churning, and examined it closer. The latch was old and rusted, but still intact, securing a small trapdoor in the floor. My mind raced. Why would there be a trapdoor in a bedroom? And why was it locked? I hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, I unlatched the trapdoor and pulled it open. The smell hit me full force, a wave of rot and filth that made my stomach turn. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose, and shined the flashlight into the hole. It was a narrow space, barely large enough for a person, with rough wooden walls and a dirt floor. And lying at the bottom was a body. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The corpse was little more than a skeleton, the flesh long since rotted away, but the clothing was still intact, tattered and filthy, but unmistakably human. I felt bile rise in my throat as I stared down at the body. How long had it been there? Who was this person, and why had they been locked in this room? Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The door behind me creaked shut with a slow, deliberate groan. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw the door closing, seemingly on its own. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, as if the walls were closing in. I rushed toward the door, but it slammed shut just as I reached it. I grabbed the knob and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in as I banged on the door, shouting for Claire, but the house remained silent. The only sound, the frantic thudding of my heart in my ears. I turned back to the trapdoor, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. The body at the bottom seemed to shift slightly, as if disturbed by my presence. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, and I heard it again, that soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere below. My skin crawled as I realized it wasn't the sound of something tapping the floor. It was coming from the body. I backed away, my breath ragged as the corpse twitched. Its skeletal hand slowly rose from the dirt. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the small room. I fumbled with the door, my hand shaking, but it remained firmly locked. Then, as if on cue, the scratching sound returned. This time it was from all around me. The walls seemed to pulse with it, a constant grating noise that made my teeth ache. I could feel something pressing in on me, something unseen but undeniably there. Finally, the door burst open, and I stumbled out.